Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 7 lecture. So today we move into the 1990s with My Own Private Idaho, directed by Gus Van Sant. Van Sant is the only director who appears twice on our syllabus. We're seeing both this film and Good Will Hunting, which he did later in the 90s. So it's a bit interesting that he appears twice and none of the other directors we're studying this semester do. I think it's pretty clear that some of the other names on our syllabus, some of these other directors are more famous than Van Sant. They have more sort of name recognition, but he's the one who appears twice. I think in large part because he's a bit of a chameleon. He's done a lot of different types of movies, but also he's another illustration or example of one of these indie filmmakers who find some success with some of their early low budget releases, and then they're able to transition into more commercial, mainstream, lucrative filmmaking opportunities. I think his career kind of follows that trajectory, much like Spike Lee, much like a lot of the people we've looked at, the Coens, Michael Moore, but also like them, he's able to kind of maintain his own unique sensibility, his own style, even though he's worked within a lot of different genres, a lot of different subject matter, and of course, he would go on to make very big films, but he retained sort of traces of that kind of art house or arty style that he was often sort of described as putting forth here with this particular film. So I want to talk a little bit about how this film gets made, how it gets produced and distributed, because this is another part of the story that we've been telling in this class. So we've been talking about Miramax, that company founded by the Weinstein brothers, including the now, jailed sex offender Harvey Weinstein. But we know sort of the trajectory of Miramax, how it started out as this independent studio, a distribution company initially focused on like concert films. Then they start producing movies. Then they get into the home video business in the 80s. And they kind of make it big near the end of the 80s with movies like The Thin Blue Line and Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which was part of that big boom in 89 when several indie films ended up making money and getting both critically acclaimed and pretty popular to boot. So Miramax kind of follows that trajectory, an independent studio that makes it kind of big while specializing in sort of arty, independent, often low-budget movies. And then what happens, largely as a result of their success, they get bought by Disney in the early 90s, but are allowed to still kind of operate autonomously, sort of, continuing to conduct business as they had been previously, even though they're now under this new sort of corporate umbrella. Where, well, a very similar story plays out with the company, the studio that produces and distributes My Own Private Idaho. So New Line Cinema was a studio initially founded as a distribution company in New York City in the late 60s. And New Line started out focused primarily on art house films, a lot of the kind of stuff that Pearson was talking about in the early part of his book. The whole sort of scene that he was describing in New York, where a lot of cinephiles, movie buffs, college students, artists were interested in European art films and maybe a few indie productions from the States as well. So New Line actually started out focused on distributing European art house films to college students, trying to get them shown largely to college students in and around college campuses in the greater sort of NYC area. And then about a decade after its founding, the company starts to produce its own films. So it's becoming a full-fledged studio, getting in on the production side as well as distributing. And then they kind of strike gold in the 80s with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, the Freddy Krueger movies. They end up producing and distributing those films. They become very successful, and that's really kind of how the studio studio breaks through, but it's still an independent studio at this point, kind of operating outside the main Hollywood power structure, but that's not going to last. In 1990, New Line creates Fine Line Features, which is the art house division of the larger studio. So basically, the art house division or branch specializes in those indie kind of art house films that New Line had initially specialized in when it was first starting out back in the late 60s. But by 1990, New Line was too big. It had sort of transitioned to more mainstream films, so they created this subsidiary, this sort of branch, this division called Fine Line to specialize in those kind of arty films, much like My Own Private Idaho. So that's what happens at the beginning of the 90s, and then Fine Line is able to find some success in the early part of that decade, not only with this film in 91, but also with a couple of movies directed by Robert Altman in 92 and 93. Altman was a pretty big deal back in the 70s, a pretty famous American director. He did the movie version of MASH, sort of the original MASH version back in the 70s, did some other big films during that decade, but in the early 90s he was sort of making a comeback after many years of inactivity. So Fine Line produced and distributed The Player and Shortcuts, two award-winning films by Altman that came out in 92 and 93. Shortcuts is based on the short fiction of Raymond Carver, who's a very important American author of the 20th century, so I recommend that one. So Fine Line was doing pretty well with these sort of more niche, specialized kinds of movies, not the kinds of big blockbusters that New Line was increasingly getting involved with. The big parent studio, they really struck gold throughout the 90s with some big hits, including some Jim Carrey movies, The Mask. They also did Dumb and Dumber. They did Seven, starring Brad Pitt, Gwyneth Paltrow, Morgan Freeman. The First Friday movie that would eventually spawn a whole series throughout the later 90s into the 2000s. Boogie Nights, and they distributed Hoop Dreams in 94. Now, they did not produce Hoop Dreams. New Line just bought the film after it had been independently produced and then distributed it. And of course, we're going to watch Hoop Dreams later in this semester, one of the most successful American documentaries of all time. So New Line was having a lot of success throughout the 90s. They also did the Austin Powers movies, and then in the early 2000s, they produced and distributed the Lord of the Rings movies. So they really had a big payday through those. So as New Line is getting really big and prominent, we can see why they would need that art house division, Fine Line Features, to specialize in movies like the early features of Gus Van Sant. So Van Sant starts his relationship with New Line back in '89 with Drugstore Cowboy. That was his second film following 1986's Mala Noche. So by the time we move up to 91 in My Own Private Idaho, this is his third big feature, much like Spike Lee, his third full-length feature, just like Do the Right Thing was Spike Lee's third. So yeah, in 86, Mala Noche comes out. It's based on a book, an autobiography written by Walt Curtis, who's kind of a Portland, Oregon personality, a writer. I think he hosts a radio show in Portland still, or at least he used to. So that movie's largely based on Curtis's book. And then in 89, Van Sant does Drugstore Cowboy, starring Matt Dillon and Kelly Lynch, about these drug addicts, these sort of itinerant kind of drifters who rob pharmacies to fuel their drug habit. Set in kind of a similar milieu to what we see in My Own Private Idaho, the Pacific Northwest, kind of gritty. These people are kind of off the grid. They're living a very alternative lifestyle, obviously. So that movie made some waves in '89. It was well received critically. and I'm pretty sure New Line at least distributed that one. So then in 91, Van Sant is shopping the script for my private for my own private Idaho, and he's getting a little bit of studio interest. Drugstore Cowboy gets him on the map, and it gets some studios, some big studios, interested in him, but they don't really like the script for Idaho. It's maybe a little too subversive, maybe a little too sexualized at times for some of these studio execs. There's still obviously a lot of prejudice, as we can imagine, about, gay characters, certain themes maybe connected to the LGBTQ community. But as we're going to see, this movie's part of a larger movement that's going on in the early 90s, the new queer cinema that's really kind of changing the way some of these conversations and some of these depictions on screen are being thought of and received. But there's still a little bit of pushback probably against the subject matter. A lot of studios turn it down, so eventually Van Sant finds financing through Fine Line Features, which has come into existence by 91. So they put up the money to produce the film, and then they also distribute it. Still, again, Fine Line is kind of operating as a separate entity, but still sort of a part of New Line Studio. But then in 93, just a couple of years after this movie comes out, all of New Line Studio, and that includes Fine Line, the entire studio gets purchased by TBS, the Ted Turner's media empire, Turner Broadcasting System, TBS. They buy up New Line Cinema, and that obviously includes the art house division, Fine Line, but business sort of continues as it was. They're kind of left alone. The studio is allowed to kind of operate autonomously, a lot like Miramax. So they continue to specialize and focus really on the same types of films, particularly Fine Line, working with indies, low-budget films, sometimes producing them, sometimes finding independently produced movies, buying them, and distributing them. But that's kind of the business model that we've already seen. We see it play out with Miramax, and we see it play out very similarly with New Line Cinema, a studio that starts out independent and focusing on independent film, but then they eventually get sort of, brought into this larger corporate sort of power structure that it seems like that's almost inevitable with a lot of these successful independent studios. They're eventually going to get bought up, but largely so they can continue to do what they've been doing, specializing in these kinds of movies. So it happens with Miramax, and it happens again here. And a few years after that initial sort of corporate merger or takeover in 96, Time Warner buys up all of TBS. So that includes New Line and, of course, Fine Line as well. But again, life doesn't change all that much for the art house division. They're still doing what they've been doing. They just have different corporate masters. And I think once New Line got purchased by Time Warner, I think they became part of the largest media company in the world. I think Time Warner at least did have that honor at one time. Maybe it still does. I'm not sure. But again, it just raises some of these questions that we've already mentioned about what is independent cinema and at what point do movies stop being independent. We've already seen films that get produced independently, but then they are bought and distributed by major studios or the branches or arms or divisions of major studios. So maybe these questions don't matter that much, but it is interesting after studios like Miramax, like New Line, get bought by the likes of TBS and Disney and Time Warner. It's interesting to see kind of if any changes occur in terms of the types of films they're producing, the ways these films are getting marketed. Or is it truly business as usual? Business stays the same. I don't know. We'll be able to track that a little bit more because we're going to see some more films from Miramax. I'm not sure off the top of my head if we're going to see more films from New Line, but we're definitely going to see some post-Disney acquisition Miramax films later in the semester. So we can kind of ask, hey, does this change the way that we perceive these movies? But anyway, getting back to this film in particular, like I've already mentioned, it's a part of a larger movement in the early 90s, often called the New Queer Cinema. And it's hard to say exactly when the movement starts. I think some of the early moves were being made in the 80s, and we've already seen an example of that with Parting Glances, which of course came out in 86. So like Parting Glances, there were increasing numbers of films in the early 90s that were frankly depicting gay life in ways that had not previously really been seen in a lot of American movies. So we've talked about this before, how there was a lot of sort of gay subtext and a lot of traditional Hollywood films, but it was always pushed into the margins. It was never really dealt with frankly, openly, honestly. And if gay characters were on screen, or if there were certain mentions of alternative identities, those things were often treated as deviant or strange or even dangerous in some ways. So we talked about how that was really beginning to change in the 80s with films like Parting Glances that just depict gay characters as being very normal in many ways. That might not strike us as noteworthy today. It's become, I think, increasingly common, but in the 80s, in the early 90s, not common to honestly depict gay life, gay characters, and themes that would have been important or maybe unique to the LGBTQ community. So in the early 90s, we just have more movies doing this, offering these kinds of honest representations. So this film is one of several. It gets lumped in with a bunch of others that come out at around the same time. Poison, directed by Todd Haynes in 1991. Young Soul Rebels, directed by Isaac Julian, also in 91. And in that same year, Edward III, directed by Derek Jarman, an adaptation of a Shakespeare play that I think, as we'll see in a moment, has some things in common with My Own Private Idaho. And then in 92, The Living End by Greg Araki, another sort of important kind of landmark film, part of this larger movement. And just the idea of a queer cinema is often thought of as kind of starting with academic discourse from the 80s. A lot of academic writing from film scholars, film historians, film theorists, and also people working within literature and other sort of domains of cultural studies, and this idea of kind of reclaiming that word and using it to sort of consider not only older films that might have had interesting things to say about some of these themes and characters and situations, but it was all sort of kept coded or implied, and also shedding light on new films, new voices that were representing some of these groups. So we can put this particular film within that larger context, sort of providing these honest, unapologetic depictions of gay life. And like we said with Parting Glances, here we have gay characters who aren't really grappling, at least most of them don't seem to be grappling with their identity or sort of viewing their sexual preference or identity as like a problem to overcome or something to sort of get straight or get, right with. The exception, of course, would be Scott. And I think we can sort of debate Scott's relationship with his own identity and what he sort of sees himself as or what he wants to be. And he obviously undergoes a huge change over the course of the film. So we can think more about that. But for the most part, most of these characters, like the characters in Parting Glances, seem to have kind of accepted their identity, their place in society. But of course, we are in a very different milieu here. We are far removed from the upwardly mobile, affluent lifestyles that we saw in Parting Glances. Now we have street hustlers, street life. In these sort of gritty urban spaces of Seattle and then mostly Portland for much of the film until our two leads, go overseas and we end up in Italy. So again, there's a lot of novel aspects to this film, or at least they would have been somewhat novel in 91 to a lot of American filmgoers who just had not seen a lot of honest depictions of gay life previously. But there's also a lot of familiar aspects here. And I think our two leads, our two main characters, seem somewhat familiar in a lot of ways. Mike and Scott, played by River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves, respectively, they're sort of recognizable prototypes in some ways. Sort of alienated youth, updated to a grungy kind of early 90s Pacific Northwest environment. But we also should keep in mind that Van Sant is working with some source material here. So yeah, these guys are kind of rebels without a cause. The kind of disaffected youth trope runs through a lot of American fiction, going all the way back, and certainly with movies, we can go all the way back to James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, the 50s, the 60s, brought us a lot of these character types. So we can maybe fit these guys into that general mold. But Van Sant's also working with a book, a 1963 novel called City of Night, written by John Ricci, which is very much about street life, hustling in major western cities, largely LA, but I think some of the book might take place in Portland. I'm not quite sure. I haven't read the book myself, but I know a lot of it's based in LA. So Van Sant's working with that sort of, it's an autobiography. He's sort of loosely working with it, using it as source material. He's also using Shakespeare, as we're going to see in a moment. He's using Shakespeare a lot, particularly Henry IV, a pretty well-known play that Shakespeare wrote. We're seeing a lot from part 1 and part 2 of Henry IV, so we'll walk through a little bit of that particular influence. But just going back to Ricci's novel, one thing that we kind of see show up in the movie, one aspect from the book, my understanding is that a lot of the hustlers that Ricci writes about do not identify as gay. They have sex with men for money, but they view it more kind of transactionally, I guess. They're not really viewing it as a central component to their identity. And I think we see that with Scott. Scott has a sort of a strained, some might even say, kind of maybe unhealthy or sort of denialist type of attitude about his own sort of identity and this idea that men can't be in love with one another. And we do see him get into a relationship with a woman by the end of the film. So certainly, we don't need to confine him to some kind of tightly regulated category or box, but he seems to be sort of endorsing or embodying some of these perspectives, some of these sort of worldviews that are depicted in that particular book, in Ricci's City of Night. So Van Sant's drawing on that. He's also drawing on some things that he knew himself. He lived in Portland. He moved back to Portland in the 80s. He had lived there previously as a young man, but he moved back after spending some time, I think, in LA. He moved back to Portland and became very interested in street life and hustlers and those types of characters. So not only is he working with the book, but he's also drawing a little bit on what he knew. I think he kind of had some informal interviews with some of these kind of street hustler types and talked to some of them, got to know some of them a little bit. So even though he didn't live these experiences himself, I think he gathered some perspectives and learned some things from some of these street denizens in Portland. So he's drawing from a lot of sources, and I think one of the effects that come from that is a real sense of realism here. I mean, he is realistically depicting their way of life, how they survive. But there's also comedy here. It is pretty gritty. There's also comedy, there's levity, there's, I think, a real focus on relationships, different relationships. Obviously, the central relationship is between Mike and Scott, kind of a case of unrequited love. So there's a lot that we can do here with the subject matter, but also I think it's a pretty visually arresting film. Interesting, pretty dynamic. Van Sant himself has a background as a photographer. So we can see some really nicely framed shots here. And in the midst of all of that realism, we can also see little touches, we might call them surrealistic or almost absurd moments that kind of interrupt the realistic spell at times. So I'm thinking of the scene where we see Scott and Mike on the cover of those sort of like beefcake magazines, and they start talking both directly to the camera, really to the audience, and also amongst themselves. Some of the other cover models begin to speak. So we have moments like that. Also the elaborately staged poses of the nude bodies, again, maybe hearkening back to Van Sant's past as a photographer, kind of using that in lieu of maybe some traditional sex scenes at times. So there's a lot visually that I think we can consider that kind of combination of realistic, sort of on the street principal photography mixed in with some flights of fancy and some other touches. And then there's the whole Shakespearean thing. So I wanted to spend some time on this and the influence that we can track from Henry IV. So really, the entire narrative arc of Scott is basically lifted directly from this play by Shakespeare. So some of you might be familiar with Henry IV. It's pretty famous. It's been adapted in a lot of different ways on the stage, in film. But just to give you a really quick synopsis, it's about a young prince, Prince Harry, I think sometimes referred to as Prince Hal. He's the heir apparent to the throne of England, but as a young man, he's a bit of a troublemaker and a carouser, and he likes to have fun, and he likes to go out to the taverns, and he has sort of a crew of friends that he gets up to no good with. They sort of get into some trouble. They're sort of minor criminals at times. And the central figure of this kind of merry band of pranksters that he kind of runs with is this guy Falstaff. Some of you might be familiar with the character. He gets parodied a lot. He's the basis of a lot of other characters that kind of turn up in different cultural works. But he's basically this big fat guy, sort of a larger than life personality, the life of the party, kind of the spiritual leader of this band that the prince hangs out with. A bit of a criminal, kind of a thief, but very generous, likes to drink and eat and be merry, but also kind of has pretensions of being like a nobleman or being sort of an important figure. And Prince Harry likes to kind of puncture his self-importance and poke some fun at Falstaff, and they have a very loving but sort of teasing relationship. And in some ways, Falstaff is a little bit of a father figure to the prince because he's a bit alienated from his own family. So if that sounds familiar, it's because, it's very much the basis of what we see with Scott. Scott is the prince, right? He's Prince Harry or Prince Hal. And Bob, the character of Bob, who we meet around the half-hour mark of the movie, he is obviously based on Falstaff. So again, this kind of larger-than-life figure, the spiritual leader of this sort of group of like homeless hustlers and drifters. They all kind of congregate in this flop house in Portland. So Bob seems to be kind of the leader. He's kind of admired, kind of looked up to, but we see that same kind of relationship that I just described. He's kind of a mentor to Scott, but Scott also kind of recognizes that Bob is ridiculous and kind of undermines him a little bit, has some fun at Bob's expense. But a lot of what we see in that middle is kind of a middle sequence of the film, beginning around the 27-minute mark and extending up until about the 45-minute mark. That extended sequence really is lifted directly from Henry IV. So we don't have to go through this line for line, but it is interesting to see how Van Sant uses Shakespeare as another one of his source materials. So in some cases, he's actually quoting directly from the play. So I have my Shakespeare here. I'm going to read a few lines that show up verbatim in the movie. And then in other cases, it's not so much direct quoting, it's more like paraphrasing. And a lot of critics commented on this. They said that Van Sant kind of paraphrases Shakespeare. Oftentimes, he'll change some of the wording, but the ideas are largely the same. So we get this beginning around the 30-minute mark, and then it goes up to that robbery scene that you might remember where they rob the rock promoters. But of course, Scott and Mike kind of pull a prank on Bob and the rest of the crew by robbing them after they've robbed the rock promoters, and then they later reveal that they have the money after Bob is kind of dejected and claims that they've been attacked by all these people and lost the money. So all of that plotting comes directly from the play. And like I said, the relationship between Scott and Bob very much comes from the play. So Scott's whole narrative arc is almost directly from the play, from Henry IV. He really is Prince Harry. So we get some direct quotes. Like we hear Bob say at one point, and this is from the play, this is Act 1, Scene 2, very early on when we're first meeting Falstaff, we hear him say, "Let us be Diana's foresters, gentlemen of the shade, minions of the moon, and let men say we be men of good government." So we hear Bob say that at one point. Later on, Scott kind of jokingly, tells him, "Oh, you're going to switch professions. You're going to go from being a thief to being a preacher," or something to that effect. And Bob says, "Oh, but being a thief is my vocation." Well, that comes directly from Falstaff a little bit later in that same scene. He says, "Why, how? 'Tis my vocation." How? We're talking about thieving, stealing. He says, "'Tis no sin for a man to labor in his vocation." And we hear Bob say that. But really, if you flip to, let's see, this is Act 2, Scene 5. I know you guys don't have the play in front of you probably, but if you think about the film right after the robbery, when Scott is kind of, having fun with Bob, asking Bob what happened the night before and why he doesn't have the money, that whole exchange is basically lifted from, this is Act 2, Scene 3, I believe. Act 2, Scene 5. And that's where, sorry, I just accidentally started playing the movie again. That's where this whole exchange basically starts. But they're not quoting a lot of this. It's kind of paraphrased. But it begins with Scott, Prince Hal, basically asking, "Hey, what happened? What happened last night?" And then Falstaff, or Bob in the movie version, spins this tall tale, this embellished tale about being attacked by all these people and fighting valiantly before ultimately giving up the money. So in the Shakespeare, Falstaff says, "The money was taken from us, 100 upon poor 4 of us," saying that 100 men set upon them. And he says, "I was fighting them. I escaped only through a miracle." But then the number of attackers keeps changing. So it keeps, going from 20 to 16 to 4. And then I was fighting 2, but I thought it was 4. And we see Scott kind of having fun with him, contradicting him. But then a little bit later in this scene, we do get a few direct quotes, if I recall. Trying to find a few of them. But they change a little bit around. But that whole exchange about it was so dark you couldn't see your own hand. That comes from the play, but then later Bob says, "Oh, they were wearing green," and Scott says, "How could you tell they were wearing green if it was so dark that you couldn't see your hand?" And then we hear Scott say a direct quote from Prince Harry, "I'll be no longer guilty of this sin." And then he gets up and sort of berates, in a joking manner, Bob, calls him a horseback breaker, a bed presser. In the Shakespeare, he's a huge hill of flesh. I think in the movie, he might be something of jelly, like a pot of jelly or something. So they changed a few things, but again, we hear Scott say, "What trick, what device canst thou now find out to hide thee from this open and apparent shame?" So he kind of calls Bob on his BS, and he delivers that very line. And then maybe the last direct quote from the play that we hear is Bob saying, "By the Lord, I knew ye as well as he that made ye. Why, hear you, my masters. Was it for me to kill the heir apparent? Should I turn upon the true prince?" And then they insert a different line or two, and then it's back to the source. "Why, thou knowest I am as valiant as Hercules, but beware instinct. The lion will not touch the true prince. Instinct is a great matter. I was now a coward on instinct." And he goes on and on. They don't get the whole bit, but that first part of the quote where he says, "Shall I turn upon the true prince? The lion will not touch the true prince." That's all Falstaff. And we hear Bob recite those lines towards the end of that scene. So kind of fun, and then it's interesting to watch the relationship play out later when we see Bob confront Scott at the restaurant near the end. Like I said, by this point Scott's inherited the money, he's become very successful, and that particular exchange when Scott says, "I don't know you, old man," that comes from much later. That's Henry IV, Part 2, Act 5, Scene 5, near the end of the entire play. Similar circumstance. Prince Hal has become King Henry. He no longer has time for his old good time buddies. He has repudiated his past, all of his mischief making as a youth. He's becoming a sober adult. But there's some kind of event, I think it's like the coronation or some kind of state event, and Falstaff, along with a few cronies, kind of tries to approach the king, and famously Henry says, "I know thee not, old man." And again, they're paraphrasing a little bit more from that exchange. He does kind of acknowledge that, yes, when I was younger, you were sort of my mentor, but now I don't need you anymore. My life has changed. I've changed. But most of what Scott's saying in that scene is, again, kind of paraphrased. It's not quite directly quoting the king in the play, but it's the same basic meaning. It's the same gist. So that whole arc is very much indebted to what we see in Henry IV. So it's interesting to observe that, because that doesn't have a lot to do with Mike. So we might think of Mike as our real protagonist here, or certainly he and Scott share the honor. But this particular arc, the whole Falstaff and Prince Hal relationship, that's all Scott and Bob. But Bob only really appears for that lengthy sequence for about 18 minutes, and then he reappears at the end to reenact that whole "I know thee not" exchange that I just described. So that's about it. Bob is not on screen for a lot of time, but that relationship seems central to the Scott character. It drives a lot of his own personal narrative, and we see Scott in this process of change throughout much of the sort of third and final act of the movie. So that's another interesting source material to track. And if you look at that sequence when they're in the flop house, there's a lot of active, dynamic camera work that really kind of matches the rapid dialogue, and the almost stage-like staging feels a little bit like a stage play as they move around. It's a very physical, active scene, that exchange between Scott and Bob in particular that I was just reading from, that kind of confrontation after the robbery. We see a lot of movement, the camera's moving, we get different angles, different perspectives as these two perform. And again, it feels a little bit like a play. The language, the staging, the way those bodies are moving. It's a really dynamic, fun, sort of exhilarating part of the movie, but then it stops, right? That flop house gets raided, the merry band of hustlers kind of gets broken up, and then we enter into a very different section or period of the film. Because all this stuff, the Prince Hal, the Falstaff, all that stuff, that's not the whole film. That's just a part of the film, and we kind of move beyond it, but we're still watching Scott's arc as he changes. But meanwhile, Mike maybe is more static, more trapped. He's obviously in love with Scott, and a lot changes for the two of them by, I would call it sort of the third act of the movie, when they go to Italy. And it suddenly feels like we're in a very different film. They go to Italy to search for Mike's mother, who had apparently gone there years earlier. We know a little bit about Mike's sort of fractured, troubled home life. So the contrast between the two characters certainly is meant to be very noticeable, and I think we should consider it. Scott sort of choosing this hustling life, but only until he inherits the family money, only until he turns 21. So kind of, again, a little bit of a type. The rich kid sort of slumming it, knowing that it's just for a short period of time. And then we can contrast him to Mikey, who, again, seems more just kind of trapped in this life, maybe not really choosing it in the same way, not exercising the same level of agency that Scott has. And of course, we know that Mike suffers from narcolepsy, which makes him very vulnerable. It leads to some laughs, it creates some comedic moments, but we sense very early on that he kind of relies on Scott to kind of take care of him at times, because he passes out at some very inopportune moments, and if it's not for Scott's intervention, he could fall in maybe some wrong hands, and we kind of see that at the end of the film. He's no longer with Scott. He passes out on that lonely, open stretch of road in Idaho. We kind of end where we start the film, and then we see him picked up, sort of bodily picked up after being robbed. So as he lies there, in the road, one car stops and they rob him. They take his shoes and I think some other possessions. And then after that, he's bodily taken and put in a car, and we don't know what happens to him. So that final part, the final sort of act of the film, is sort of a story of loss. It's kind of the story of Mike and Scott drifting apart. Scott literally choosing a new life. With Carmela, the young Italian woman he meets during their travels. And again, it feels like we're in a different movie in a lot of ways once we get to Italy. It's sort of like a travelogue at this point. With these two guys, we've left behind a lot of the other supporting characters that we spent earlier parts of the movie with. So now it's kind of pastoral. We're in Italy, a very different milieu, very different setting. We linger on some of that natural beauty, some of that scenery. But in terms of thematics, we watch as Scott, I don't know how we want to describe it, adopts a more conventional lifestyle, falls in love with the young woman, and kind of leaves Mikey behind. So we have a lot of themes here: unrequited love, young people searching for some kind of identity that they can call their own. Again, Scott seems to be in a search. He seems to be searching for himself. And a lot of people interpret that as a key theme in Shakespeare's play. Prince Hal is discovering himself. He's growing up. He's discovering what kind of person, what kind of man, what kind of ruler he wants to be. And Scott is in a somewhat similar position. But Mikey, I don't know. I don't know if Mikey is experiencing quite the same level of growth and development. He seems more trapped and sort of optionless. But he's obviously a very sympathetic character. As we sort of see his vulnerability, we see the things that he is trying to overcome in his life, his background, his sort of frayed relationships with his parents, and he just seems rather alone in the world, especially after Scott kind of moves on and doesn't have time for him anymore. A lot of attention was placed on the cast when this film first came out. So some of you might be familiar with River Phoenix, the older brother of Joaquin Phoenix, who's a pretty well-known actor today, kind of known for appearing in a lot of offbeat independent films, but he's been in some big movies as well. He was in the recent Joker film, kind of known for playing dark, tortured characters. That's kind of his thing. He was in The Master. He's been in some other pretty big movies. But River Phoenix was an ascending star in the late 80s, early 90s, when Joaquin was still just a kid actor. River Phoenix was becoming a real box office star. So he started out as a kid actor as well. But by the late 80s, he was a teenager, kind of a heartthrob. And this was one of several critically acclaimed performances that he turns in. A lot of people just kind of fell in love with his character, kind of vulnerable, a bit moody, a bit erratic, certainly offbeat. But he sort of channels a real sweetness, I think, and he's obviously in love with Scott. A lot of people talk about that campfire scene between the two of them, as Scott kind of has a bit of a cynical attitude, perhaps, or at least sort of, he's, I guess, sort of trying to be gentle, but essentially telling Mike that a real relationship, a romantic relationship between the two of them, it's not really on the table. And Mike sort of expresses himself kind of not super articulately, but that scene, the way it's played, got a lot of attention. A lot of people thought that there was real pathos there, and the way River Phoenix sort of portrayed this character who struggles to express himself, but really does seem to have a big heart. And he seems like a sweet, caring individual who's often placed in a lot of difficult situations, dangerous situations, as we see at times. And again, without Scott, we kind of wonder, what is next for him. And then, of course, you might know the story of River Phoenix. He died just 2 years after this film came out. He died in 93 of a drug overdose in Los Angeles. He was only 23 years old, so very tragic. And people, I think, also see some parallels maybe between actor and character. He's obviously playing a character here. It's not autobiographical, but just certain aspects of the character, the sort of maybe slightly lost quality, misguided, although a lot of people claim that River Phoenix was not a huge drug user ordinarily, but had overdosed that night. But the vulnerability, the sensitivity, the sort of artistic qualities that the actor was known for, I think often get read into the character. And that can be a little bit that can sometimes work as a way to appreciate or analyze the character, but I think we should also remember that he was a very skilled actor. He wasn't just playing himself, but we can probably see some parallels. And then Keanu Reeves playing Scott, and I would assume most of us know who Keanu Reeves is. He has become, of course, a very big movie star, but in the early 90s, he wasn't yet viewed by many as a serious actor. He had kind of risen to fame through the Bill and Ted movies, which sort of exhibited his comedic abilities, but he wasn't really thought of as a serious dramatic actor. Critics were a little bit divided on his performance here. Some thought that it was quite good and very nuanced and very sort of vital and active and exciting. Others thought that it was a little bit of a reach for Reeves, that he maybe didn't quite know how to embody a character like this. I don't know. I want to hear what you guys think. He's certainly an actor that we recognize, whether it be from like The Matrix or, John Wick or whatever. So we kind of already have maybe some preconceived notions about him, or we feel like he plays certain types of characters, maybe. So this might be a departure, a little bit like Steve Buscemi in Parting Glances, might be a little bit of a departure to see this actor playing this role. But again, I want us to think about how Scott changes and the way we see him at the end of the film. And does Reeves have the ability to pull that off? And how does he handle the Shakespeare? Again, if you go back to that sequence that I was describing, again, rewatch some of those exchanges. The robbery itself kind of appears in a similar form in the text. I was going to read you that passage when they hear about the score. It's obviously not rock promoters in the play, but it's some rich guys that they decide to rob. But I won't bore you with that. If you're interested, again, I would check it out. I would go to Henry IV. Like I said, a lot of what we see in the movie comes from Act 2, Scene 5. And then that final exchange with Bob and Scott comes from Part 2 of Henry IV, Act 5, Scene 5, near the very end. So it's interesting to observe that stuff, and how well does Keanu Reeves do that? How does he portray the change in this character? Again, people are kind of divided. I'd like to hear your thoughts. William Richard plays Bob. He actually wrote and directed a film starring River Phoenix that had come out a few years earlier. I think it was called A Night in the Life of Bobby Reardon, kind of a coming-of-age tale set in the 50s. Sort of a star vehicle for Phoenix, but it was not a big success. So he plays Bob, and he seems very comfortable with the kind of grandiose, verbose Falstaff character. He seems at home there, but I'd like to hear what you guys think about his interplay with Reeves. James Russo was kind of well known for being in gangster movies and crime dramas. He plays the weirdly Brooklynite type father, maybe actually the father of Mike. We visit his trailer, get sort of an emotional scene there. He became a pretty well-known supporting actor in the years following. So you guys can think about any of those roles. Udo Kier plays Hans, a German actor. He becomes a pretty well-known character actor as well. Was in some big films in the 90s and the 2000s. But most people think primarily about River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves when they're thinking about the performances in this film. And think about that friendship. Think about some of the themes of friendship and relationships. We might come back to some of those when we talk about Van Sant's other film that we're going to watch this semester, Good Will Hunting. Different milieu, different kinds of relationships, obviously different characters, but there might be some carryover. So a lot to do with this film. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and we're coming up pretty soon on spring break. So next week, we're going to do Dazed and Confused. That's our final film before the break. We'll check out the Austin, Texas scene and Richard Linklater. And then right after the break, when we come back, we're going to check out Go Fish by Rose Troche, another part of this queer American cinema movement of the early 90s. Sort of that same sort of movement that we can put this film in. So that's what we have coming up. We'll have a break soon, so you guys might be able to catch up a little bit if you need to. Get in touch with me if you need anything, if you have questions, or if you're having trouble accessing any of the films. And I'll see you next week.